and thank you for joining us. I am Anarata Bishaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this week event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions and comments. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Professor Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Цілий свідок вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякуємо вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you. And today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett. The rest, please, of us turn off your cameras. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad and happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ilya Somin, who agreed to talk to us about Western response on refugee crisis. Ilya is professor of law at George Mason University. He authored a number of books, including Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration and Political Freedom, revised edition last year, Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, and others. Dr. Somin published numerous articles in a variety of popular press outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, The Atlantic, USA Today, and he is a regular contributor to the popular Volokh Conspiracy, Law and Politics blog. He was also contributing to Russian service of the Voice of America and Radio Liberty, where he was an occasional partner of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the famous Russian dissident recently sentenced to 25 years in prison in Moscow. Ilya, the microphone is yours. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us on the refugee crisis.
Thank you very much for having me. In a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that will enable me to do the PowerPoint for the presentation. But thank you to Victor for organizing this event and to Marshall University. Let's see if I can bring up the PowerPoint presentation. The refugee crisis created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Depending on how you count, it may be the biggest refugee crisis anywhere since World War II, but it's certainly one of the biggest. And some of what I'm going to say in this presentation is based on my book, Free to Move, which was published last year. But there are also obviously various points specific to the current crisis that are not in the book, which deals with more general migration issues. So I'll start off by speaking about Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war, the moral case for accepting them, and go over what the United States and other Western nations have done in this respect and what still remains to be done, how the policies can be improved. Then I will talk about the more controversial issue of Russians fleeing Vladimir Putin's increasingly tyrannical regime, and I will argue that we should accept those people as well for both moral and strategic reasons. And finally, I'll talk about some broader implications of this issue for refugee and migration policy generally. So we'll start off with the issue of Ukrainian refugees. By various estimates by the United Nations and other agencies, there are some 7 to 8 million Ukrainians who have fled their country since the Russian invasion that began in February 24th of last year. As I already mentioned, this is the largest refugee crisis that has been occurred in Europe since World War II, possibly the largest anywhere in the world since World War II, though figures for both this crisis and others are inexact. And there are very strong moral reasons for taking the refugees, fleeing this invasion. Obviously, they're facing war and destruction of their homes, businesses, and the like. They're also facing very severe Russian atrocities of various kinds, the massacre of civilians, the repression of anybody who seems like they might oppose Russian rule in the areas that were conquered. Also things like the kidnapping and deportation of many people. Authorities estimate that some 1 million Ukrainians have been forcibly deported to Russia from the territories that Russia has seized since last year. Also, many thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcibly separated from their families and taken to Russia. So from any reasonable point of view, there are very severe human rights problems here, atrocities, and much else. Many legal scholars argue it amounts to genocide, but even if it does not, it is certainly atrocities on a very large scale, and there is an obvious moral case for welcoming people who flee such things. In addition, there is a strategic and economic case as well. The Ukrainian refugees can contribute to our economies and that of other Western nations. Ukrainian, Russian immigrants and others have disproportionately contributed to the economy and also to scientific research and innovation in the past, and given the chance, they can do so now as well. I'll next talk about what has been done already in the United States and other countries in order to facilitate entry and assimilation of Ukrainian refugees. In the United States, the Biden administration has created the Uniting for Ukraine program, which enables Americans and permanent residents in the United States to sponsor Ukrainian refugees, and if they are admitted onto this program, they can stay in the U.S. and work here for up to 2 years. And I should mention that I myself am a sponsor in this program. My wife and I have sponsored a Ukrainian family. What's impressive about this program is how quick and effective it is. Within 9 days of our filing the documents on the USCIS website, the Ukrainian family was given permission to enter the United States, which is vastly faster than the normally extremely slow and inefficient federal immigration bureaucracy works. And I know some of the audience for this program it consists of Russian and Ukrainian speaking residents of the United States. If you're interested, you're particularly well positioned to be sponsors in this program because for obvious reasons, many Ukrainian refugees in fact speak Russian, some of them even it's their primary language. So if you're interested, this is a great opportunity to help people start a new life in greater freedom and prosperity and at little cost to yourself. In addition, last year, the Biden administration granted temporary protected status to any Ukrainians who are already in the United States as of April 11th, which enables them to live and work in the U.S. Through to a period that will run out on October 19th of this year. And a number of Ukrainians have been admitted by other kinds of pathways. All told, since February of 2022, close to 300,000 Ukrainians have been admitted into the United States, about half of them through Uniting for Ukraine and the other half through other kinds of programs. The European Union has adopted similar policies. It has granted Ukrainians the right of 3-year residency and the right to work for up to 3 years in the European Union. And in fact, several million Ukrainians are in European Union countries now, the largest number in Poland. Canada has adopted policies similar to the United States, though in some ways more expansive. They have over 130,000 Ukrainians that have entered that country since February of last year. So a lot has been achieved by the U.S. and the European Union and Canada in response to this refugee crisis, but there are improvements that can still be done. The biggest one is that we should make the legal status of the Ukrainians who have entered permanent. Right now, the Uniting for Ukraine status expires after 2 years, which for many of the people admitted, their expiration will start to come in 2024. and after that they could be subject to deportation, or at least they wouldn't be allowed to work legally in the United States. Those who are here and under temporary protected status, that status expires on October 19th of this year, so it is coming soon. The president can use his executive authority to extend these deadlines further if he wants to, and I think there's a good chance that will be done. However, the ultimate solution to this problem is for Congress to pass an adjustment act which would give the Ukrainians who have been admitted the right to legal permanent residency within the United States and also the right to work in the United States indefinitely. This would be beneficial for them, and it would also be beneficial for the U.S. economy. Obviously, people who are not allowed to work legally or who are potentially subject to deportation, they're less likely to be able to work to contribute to the economy, and they're less likely to be able to assimilate effectively. So both for American interests and also out of a sense of justice to the people in question, it is highly desirable that Congress pass a Ukrainian Adjustment Act, similar to the adjustment acts that in the past have been done for Cuban refugees, for Hungarians fleeing the Soviet invasion of 1956, and also for other groups. For those interested, just today, actually, I published an article in the Boston Globe which addresses this issue in greater detail. I now want to turn to the more controversial issue of accepting Russian migrants fleeing Vladimir Putin's increasingly severe tyranny. Since February of 2022, some 1 million people have fled Russia, fleeing the increasing tyranny and fleeing the war. There are here as with the Ukrainians, there are various human rights considerations that are relevant here. In Russia, which was already a repressive government even before this war started, the repression has become much more serious. For example, under a law passed by the Russian parliament last year, merely referring to the conflict in Ukraine as a war, as opposed to a special military operation, which is the official Kremlin euphemism, you can get up to 15 years in prison just for that. And there's other punishments for anybody who speaks out against the war in any way. In addition, last fall, Vladimir Putin started the so-called partial mobilization, which forcibly conscripts men into the armed forces to fight this war. Being subject to conscription into such an unjust war is itself a human rights violation. And I would add that this mobilization has disproportionately targeted various ethnic minorities in Russia, such as the native peoples of Siberia and the Caucasus. Under American law and also under international refugee law, people fleeing racial and ethnic discrimination are entitled to asylum, and these minority groups obviously are facing that. And obviously there's other kinds of human rights violations that are being imposed here as well. I mentioned punishment to people who speak out against the war. The Russian government has also enacted more and more cruel and repressive laws punishing dissent of various kinds, most notably punishing anybody who speaks out for the rights of gays and lesbians, where the government is passing a law even right now that is increasing the punishment for that. So with Russians fleeing Putin's unjust regime, there is a strong human rights case for accepting them, just as is also the case with Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion of their country. In addition, there are important economic and strategic advantages that Western nations can get from accepting Russians fleeing Putin. One is that the Russians, like the Ukrainians, can contribute to our economies. Both we and many European countries are suffering from severe labor shortages in many parts of the economy. Russians, like Ukrainians and other immigrants, can help alleviate that. In addition, historically, Russian immigrants have contributed disproportionately to scientific, medical, and technological progress. And obviously, if we let more of them in, they can continue to do so. Indeed, many of those who have fled Russia over the last year are actually tech workers and others with specialized skills that could potentially benefit our economies. The flip side of this is that having these people leave Russia and come here imposes a brain drain on Putin and his regime. If these scientific workers and other specialists are not working in Russia for Putin's government, but are instead working here, that's a loss for him and a benefit to us. Similarly, allowing Russians to come reduces the pool of manpower that Russia can use to try to mobilize additional troops for their war. So there's that gain as well. The economist Timur Kuran early in the war proposed the idea that the United States and other Western nations should offer asylum to Russian soldiers who surrender. A lot of experts and others have chronicled how the Russian military has been suffering from morale problems during this war. Many Russian troops, for obvious reasons, are not very motivated to fight in this conflict. More would be willing to surrender, I think, if they were offered asylum in the United States or in Europe in exchange for doing so. I think that's both a humanitarian imperative, but also it can damage Russia's war effort in this conflict. It's an easy way to strengthen Ukraine's position and also at the same time to hopefully bring the war to a close sooner rather than later. Obviously, we might want to exclude those who have been guilty of war crimes, but for other Russian troops whose only wrong is that they have been forced to fight in this war, we should accept them. It is morally right to do so, and there is an obvious strategic benefit. Finally, there is a public relations advantage in the war of ideas here, that in the war that we are waging against Putin and other dictators. The key point of Putin's propaganda against the West is that Westerners are opposed to Russia in general, that we are supposed to be Russophobes and we hate Russians. If we offer asylum to surrendering Russian...
Yes.
I'm sorry, is there some sort of problem?
It's okay, everything resolved.
Okay, sorry, I apologize for any technical difficulties and I will continue. If we offer refuge to Russians fleeing Putin's tyranny and to Russian soldiers who surrender, that will be a strong counter to Putin's propaganda that the West is anti-Russian, and also it can help undermine his position in international public opinion. During the Cold War, Americans well understood that the image of people fleeing communism to come to the United States, that offered us a powerful public relations advantage in the war of ideas between communism and liberal democracy. And the same is true of the current war of ideas between liberal democracy and Putin's authoritarian nationalism. There are a number of arguments that people have offered against granting refuge to Russians. I will go over a couple of them. One very common one offered by, among others, Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, is the idea that we shouldn't offer refuge to Russians because Russian citizens have collective guilt for the war. Or as Kallas put it, every citizen is responsible for the actions of their state, and citizens of Russia are no exception. I think there are many problems with this kind of argument. I'll just mention a few. One is, I think it's unjust and wrong to say that people are responsible for the actions of an authoritarian state that they have no control over. If I were able to discuss this with Prime Minister Kallas, I would ask her whether Estonians were responsible for the injustices of the Soviet Union. After all, Estonia was part of the Soviet Union from 1940 through 1991. Most Estonians did little or nothing to try to prevent the many atrocities that the Soviet government committed during that time. So under her reasoning, Estonians, like other citizens of the Soviet Union, were responsible for all the evils that were done under Stalin, Brezhnev, and other Soviet rulers. And I think, obviously, what she might respond is that Estonians had no control over the policies of the Soviet government. At least most Estonians did not. And the same thing is true of most Russians today. In addition, it is simply not the case that people are generally responsible for other things that are done by those of the same racial or ethnic group or those of the same citizenship. Being born in a particular country is not something that you can control, and it's not something that you are morally responsible for. There is the argument also that is similar to this that is made that instead of fleeing Russia, Russians are morally obligated to stay in Russia and try to fix the government there. I think if you take this sort of argument seriously, it would turn out that the ancestors of most Americans were wrong to come to the United States. Maybe in the 19th century, they should have stayed and fixed the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the British Empire or the Russian Empire or the Empire of China as opposed to coming to the U.S. I think in those cases, it's fairly obvious that it would be wrong to insist that people should stay and live under an unjust or oppressive government merely on the hope that maybe they're doing so might improve things. And the same point applies to the Russian situation today. I say more about this in my book, Free to Move, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Another related argument is that if Russians who are opposed to war emigrate, then maybe that would reduce pressure for liberalization within Russia itself. There's not a lot of evidence that this is true. And indeed, historically, there is evidence that having a diaspora in a more liberal or freer society actually helps promote reform back home. For the people who emigrate, they continue to communicate with relatives back home. That spreads ideas there and can create pressure for liberalization. In my book, I cite social science evidence that this has been true in a number of countries. And of course, even in the history of Russia itself, reform movements have sometimes been effectively promoted by dissidents and immigrants living abroad. There are also broader implications here for refugee policy more generally. Obviously, many of the arguments that I and others have made for accepting Ukrainian and Russian migrants also apply to refugees fleeing other wars and oppressive situations elsewhere. Indeed, President Biden has already expanded the Uniting for Ukraine model to cover refugees from 4 Latin American countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. In each of these places, the population is threatened by horrific violence and tyranny. So the argument for accepting them is also there. I think some of the strategic arguments I made for accepting Russian refugees also applies to Chinese fleeing Xi Jinping's regime, which in some ways is even more repressive than Vladimir Putin's. And here too, if we wanted to, we could impose a brain drain on one of our principal adversaries, and yet so far we have not done so. Similarly, the private refugee sponsorship model, which has been used in Uniting for Ukraine, it could be extended more generally. Indeed, Canada has actually had a system like this for a long time. We could in some ways imitate their system and even expand it. For those interested, I co-authored an article about this in the Washington Post last summer. And there is the argument that it is unjust or unfair to let in Russian or Ukrainian migrants if we're not also willing to accept similarly situated people from other countries. I actually agree that it is unjust, and I believe that the same principle should be extended to these other countries. But the way to address this is not to eliminate the right to enter for Ukrainians until such time as we can expand it to every other similarly situated group. Rather, the right solution to this is to level up, not level down. And in the meantime, the best should not be the enemy of the good. If we are able at least to allow Ukrainians in, then that should be done, even if we are not yet, for political reasons, able to do it for others fleeing similar oppression in other countries. It's better to give justice to some people than to deny it to everybody. But the policies adopted for Ukrainian refugees have already served as a model to some extent for letting in those fleeing tyranny and oppression in Latin America. And given time, that model can be extended further. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions. And I will now attempt to stop sharing my screen, if I can do that. I don't know how to stop, or has the sharing stopped, or?
We still see your screen.
Okay. I don't know where the button is for to stop sharing.
Should be on the, yep.
Okay, now I can stop sharing.
Very good. Dr. Deutsch. Dr. Deutsch is our former graduate dean of Marshall University and our constant viewer. Please.
I'm going to have to leave after this question. One of the major concerns when immigrants come from a country which has been hostile to the United States is that, oh, the government will release spies. And how would you respond to that in terms of the vetting process for allowing Russians to come to the United States?
It's a good question. I addressed this in some detail in my New York Times article about this issue near the beginning of the conflict. I would respond in two ways. First, we have a long history of accepting migrants from the Soviet Union and other hostile countries, and it turns out that the rate of spying among them is actually lower than among native-born Americans, so the risk is pretty small. Secondly, the way to deal with this is not to bar migrants, but simply to have a vetting process for access to classified information, which we need to do anyway, even if all the people hired to to have access to that are native-born Americans. We still would want to vet them because obviously there is a history of native-born Americans also being spies. And obviously there are other reforms that need to be done with classified information, as we see just recently with the leak done by the 21-year-old Air National Guardsman who turns out all access to all sorts of classified information, and he leaked it to his friends on an online chat group so as to impress those people. So it seems to me that the way to deal with this is by having a better system of limiting access to classified information and doing other reforms in that area, as opposed to trying to bar migrants. You can always say, even if they don't have access to classified information, spies could potentially access other information that is just freely available in our society. But frankly, hostile intelligence services can do that anyway. That is one of the disadvantages of a relatively freer society compared to an authoritarian state, that we have a lot of information floating around. But I think the benefits of being a freer society greatly outweigh that. One of them is that we can attract talent from other countries in a way that Russia and China cannot. And indeed, we can even attract talent from those countries themselves, which simultaneously benefits us and imposes a brain drain on those governments. And that is what we should do.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question.
Please, more comments and questions from our panel and viewers. Anna.
Thank you very much for panoramic view of this very difficult situation. It's a truly important refugee crisis now we can see, and unfortunately we do not talk about this frequently. And I have a couple questions. Will Ukrainians and Russia's refugees go home? What people, ordinary people ask. And the second question also related to this, how to deal with the refugee fatigue in the West and in the former Soviet republics, because the war is very long, and that's actually, we can see everywhere certain level of anxiety. Thank you.
So two good questions. On the first one, we obviously don't know for sure whether the refugees will go home or not. But experience with past refugee crises suggests that many will not go home for two kinds of reasons. One is, even if the war ends, it will be the case that many people will not be able to pick up their lives that were broken because their homes have been destroyed, their businesses have been destroyed, and so on. In the case of Ukraine, that will particularly be true if after the war, Russia is still able to hold on to some of the territories they've conquered. I hope they will not be able to. I hope they will be driven out, but we obviously don't know how the military situation will work out. Even if they are driven out, some of these places will continue to be under threat of Russian invasion for years to come. And moreover, on the positive side, refugees who have spent years in the West will have started lives there. They have jobs, connections, and the like, and it would be unfair and unrealistic to expect them to leave that. In the case of Russian refugees, obviously, it seems likely that Russia will have a horribly oppressive government, possibly for a long time to come. And that's another reason why they would be unlikely to return. So if we look at the lessons of past refugee crises, one of them is that refugees will need a permanent home, not just a temporary one. While some may return home, and actually some Ukrainians have already returned, even without the conflict being over, many probably will never be able to return or certainly be willing to return, and we should make policy with that in mind. On the issue of refugee fatigue, I think this is something that I've written about in my book, Free to Move, in Chapter 6. Most public hostility to refugees is not due to the number of refugees, because most of the public doesn't even know how many there are, nor is it due to how long the refugees stay in the West. Rather, it is generally due to a fear or a sense of disorder that, there's disorder at the border, people are rushing in, there's chaos, there might be crime and the like. And of course, the main cause of that disorder where it occurs is the difficulty of getting in legally. As a result, if you look at the southern border of the US, or you look at the Mediterranean Sea in Europe, migrants try to get in because they're fleeing desperate situations and there's no legal pathway for them to get in. And so you get these scenes of disorder, you get criminals becoming involved in the process. And the way to address that is to make legal migration easier. If you make legal migration easy, as it is under Uniting for Ukraine, there's little or no disorder. People get in easily. There's no opportunity for criminals to become involved in the process. And indeed, there's no dramatic images of disorder that can go on TV. I mentioned earlier, I'm a sponsor in the Uniting for Ukraine program. When I submitted the paperwork for our sponsor family, within 9 days, I got approval, and their entry to the United States simply consisted of them buying plane tickets and me coming to the airport to pick them up. It was so incredibly boring that if I had alerted the media to the fact that this was happening, they almost certainly would not have bothered to show up, because there wouldn't be any interesting images to show. And that's the kind of model that we want to persist in, where legal migration is easy. As a result, there's little or no disorder at the border. We also want to make it easy for people to enter the workforce, because that is both good for our economy and also furthers assimilation and improves the refugees' language skills. So thank you. Those are two good questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Please, more questions. We have time. Katerina?
Not a question, but just a sincere thank you. I've learned so much from your presentation. And also, I really appreciate how you've matched your intellectual and scholarly and academic abilities with what appears to be a heart of gold. I'm very grateful for you calling us to both respond with our minds, but also with our hearts. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Well, thank you. I should note I'm just one of hundreds of thousands of people who have participated in the Uniting for Ukraine program. Most of them are not professional academics who study this area like I am. And many of them, unlike me, aren't even people who speak fluent Russian or Ukrainian. As I mentioned earlier, there is a particular desirability for people to serve as sponsors who do speak Russian or Ukrainian, because for obvious reasons, those are the languages that most of refugees speak.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you so much. You're very kind of you.
Ilya, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I've several times heard Ukrainian officials express a concern that they're going to lose population because refugees won't be returning, and they are very concerned about the brain drain. So could you also comment from that point of
Sure.
view?
Sure. Another good question. Let me say two things about this, one that's specific to Ukraine and one that's more general. The point specific to Ukraine is that Ukrainian officials have been saying contradictory things. On the one hand, they do express concern about drain. On the other hand, they also say they don't want refugees to come back right now because of power shortages and other issues with government services in Ukraine. And as long as the war lasts, those issues will be there. Secondly, the more general point is that while I understand the Ukrainian government may prefer to keep their talent at home, ultimately the general principle here is that people are not owned by their government. They're not owned by the majority of citizens in the country they were born in, and therefore they don't have a moral duty to live there their whole life or work there their whole life, even if the government would like them to, or even if other people in that country would like them to. I think most Americans readily recognize at this point that, say, their ancestor didn't have a moral obligation to stay in Russia or Austria or Ireland or China, even if they're, the Tsar or the Austrian Emperor or the British Empire said, well, we want these people to stay and we don't want them to take their talent to the United States. Still, they had a moral right to do so. And I think the same point applies to Ukrainians. I would add that if there is greater freedom of movement, governments, including that of Ukraine, will have more of an incentive to adopt good policies that create reasons for people to stay that are not simply by coercion or because they have no choice.
Thank you.
Thank you. While we're waiting,
Quick
Yes,
point.
please,
I put
please.
the link to your book on Amazon in the chat, and we will also make sure we include it in the YouTube thing. I can't wait to read it.
Sure, I appreciate it. I should mention 50% of all royalties generated by this book go to causes benefiting refugees, and obviously both with the Ukraine situation, but also with other situations like that of Venezuela, which is the other current refugee crisis, which is roughly on the same scale as that of Ukraine. The need today is greater than it has been in a long time.
Why am I not surprised? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
you. I have a question.
Sure, of course.
We might have more. You mentioned that presence of strong diaspora makes a lot of influence for the home country, which lives under oppressive regime. We have had examples of this, and maybe you can draw some parallels with what we know from Cuban experience.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
it's the closest to us in the United States. Did it really work this way? I just don't know much about this.
So in part as a result of diaspora, there is a movement in Cuba to get rid of the regime there and to force it to liberalize. It actually has enacted some modest degree of liberalization in recent years, though not nearly as much as it should. Obviously, Cuba is still an authoritarian communist regime. It's still very repressive. While I think the majority of the population in Cuba would like to change the government, so far they have stayed in power by force. However, there is evidence from other countries that a diaspora has led to pressure for liberalization. There are studies on countries in Central America where that has definitely been the case. I think the presence of a large Indian diaspora has helped promote liberal values in India, and there are other examples around the world. I don't claim that this is guaranteed to work or that any oppressive regime that has a large diaspora, that diaspora will swiftly lead to the overthrow of that regime. I think the evidence doesn't justify any kind of strong assertion like that. But at the margin, the existence of a diaspora in more liberal societies does create that sort of pressure. And by the way, we can see that in the history of Russia and the Soviet Union as well. In 19th century Russia, liberalization was promoted in part by exiles like Alexander Herzen and other Russian liberals who lived abroad and conveyed their ideas back to Russia. And obviously this was true during the Soviet Union. I know some of you are actually people who immigrated from the Soviet Union during that time, but also sent ideas back. And there are other examples around the world.
Yeah, we actually have, I know on the call we have Dr. Raditsky, if you're willing to turn your camera on, very strong leadership in the diaspora, both in this country, but also in Australia. The Ukrainian diaspora is pretty amazing and very well organized, very prepared to accept refugees. We have schools, we have churches, we have cultural centers in every major city. So that's actually a really interesting point. And that I never thought of until you pointed out like the value of the diaspora for good things to happen back home. We see it in countries where people come and then help the families back home. But what you're talking about is that's also good for countries who are fleeing a terrible situation, that still, that also helps. I apologize for not being very articulate about this, but I get your point, and I think it's a great point. And we've seen the power of the diaspora at work in the Ukrainian community in just under different circumstances.
Yeah. So obviously, Ukraine's current government is far better than Russia. It is not oppressive to anything like the same degree. At the same time, there are some illiberal tendencies in Ukraine of various kinds. It may not be popular to say this, but they do exist. And it may be that the existence of a strong Ukrainian diaspora in the US, Canada, and Western Europe can help promote more liberal ideas back in Ukraine. In particular, we know that even liberal democratic governments during wars, repressive policies of various kinds can crop up. They cropped up in this country during World War II, and the risk is there for Ukraine as well. And it may be that the diaspora, at least at the margin, can help have some influence and reduce that risk.
Thank you. And continuing on the same issue, how can you compare the current crisis you told us about with just a few years ago, enormous migration crisis in Europe from North Africa and Middle East, especially Syria?
Yeah, so the scale is similar in terms of the number of migrants. It may be that in the current crisis there's somewhat more, but we don't really know for sure because with both Ukraine and Syria, the numbers that we have are very imprecise. I do think that we can learn from some of the mistakes that European nations made during that crisis. One is, in many cases, they did not make it easy to enter legally. As a result, you did get the sense of disorder. The second is that when the refugees were settled in Europe, in some countries, it was difficult for them to enter the workforce, which impeded assimilation. Also, in Germany in particular, in some places, they tried to place people in rural areas where there was less infrastructure and also fewer work opportunities, and that created various problems. The other issue that arises, and this will be relevant to Ukrainians as well, is that in many Western European countries, there are very restrictive labor laws, which among other things make it difficult to fire people. You might think, well, it's good for the workers if it's hard to fire them, but the problem is if you're an employer in France or in Spain and you know it's very difficult to fire anybody, then you will tend to hire only those people that you're absolutely sure will work out well. And that will lead to a reluctance to hire recent migrants, particularly those who may not yet speak the local language well. So in the US and Canada and Britain, labor laws are less restrictive, so this is much less of a problem for us. But European countries need to reform those laws, both to make immigrant assimilation easier, but also even to just create more jobs for their native-born citizens, because as a result of these problems, the unemployment rate even for native-born Spaniards and Frenchmen is actually quite high. It's a serious problem. President Macron, the president of France, has in the past talked about this and advocated some reforms, but he hasn't actually done very much on this front since coming into office, in part because it's difficult. So this is another issue that we can learn from with the experience then. Finally, there is this elephant in the closet that so far most European nations have been more welcoming to Ukrainian refugees than they were to the Syrians before. And I do think that one of the reasons for this is racial and cultural issues, that most Ukrainian refugees are white. Not all, actually. The family I sponsored actually are Azerbaijani Muslims who are citizens of Ukraine, but most Ukrainian refugees are white Christians, and so there is less prejudice against them than there is against African and Middle Eastern refugees, many of whom are either non-white or non-Christian or both. And I think that sort of prejudice is, is harmful, and it should be condemned. Do I recognize it's difficult to reduce it quickly?
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions or comments, please? Maybe some general comments while people are thinking about some. Maybe if we have a few minutes, you can talk a little bit about Vladimir Karamurza. I know it is not a refugee
Sure.
issue, but since you personally know him.
So I know him only a little bit, having appeared with him on Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, the Russian language service of it. Obviously, he's an incredibly brave and admirable person. He deserves our respect and support. Western governments should press for his release. For those who may not know, just a few days ago, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. There are also other Russian dissenters, such as Ilya Yashin, who was sentenced to 8.5 years in December. And I would like to take this opportunity to refer people to Ilya Yashin's moving letter from prison that he wrote in December, which I also highlight on my own blog, where he cautions Westerners against ascribing collective guilt to Russians, both for the kinds of moral reasons that I mentioned earlier, but also because it's counterproductive. If we are in the mode of saying all Russians have collective guilt, that is likely to strengthen support for Putin's regime. Whereas if we're more discriminating and we say, yes, people who commit war crimes or people responsible for this policy, they deserve condemnation, they deserve punishment. Putin, I think, is a war criminal. I think other high-ranking Russian officials are as well. Some ordinary Russian soldiers also who have committed war crimes. But I think Yashin is right to counsel us against ascribing collective guilt to Russians in general, because it is both unjust and counterproductive. And I think what Yashin and Putin has done also sheds a light on those Westerners who complain that Russians haven't protested enough or haven't spoken out against the war enough. It is true that too many Russians support the war, and I think that deserves condemnation. But it is also true that many of the Westerners who, from our comfortable positions in the West, we say, well, Russians should be protesting more. How many of us would be willing to protest if the price of doing so was the kind of prison sentence that Karamurza has gotten, or that Yashin has gotten? 8.5 years in a Russian prison, to say nothing of 25 years, is no joke. Given the horrible conditions in a Russian prison system, it's even worse than being in prison for that long in Western countries. So we should not impose standards on others that we would not be willing to live up to ourselves.
I just put the article to Yashin's letter in the chat. And I also see we have a couple comments from Leslie Titus. And you can see it in the, talking about the revolution in Ukraine semi-recently. So the diaspora may have helped to promote that. And the second comment is, I heard that some Syrian refugees don't like Finland because it is boring. Interesting.
So I would say two things. One is the 2014 revolution, we want to call it that, in Ukraine had various causes, but it may well be that the diaspora had some impact on it. In particular, I think the existence of a strong Ukrainian diaspora has strengthened Ukraine's Western orientation that has increasingly arisen and certainly has promoted more respect for human rights in Ukraine. One example of this is the dramatic shift towards greater tolerance of gays and lesbians in that country. I think there is still more homophobia in Ukraine than in most Western nations, but there's a lot less than there was 10 years ago. On Syrian refugees finding Finland boring, it's hard for me to speak to that, but I suspect that many Syrian refugees would far prefer life in Syria to life in refugee camps, even if life in Finland to life in refugee camps, even if Finland is not particularly exciting. It offers job opportunities and other opportunities, and also refuge from violence and oppression that I think many Syrian refugees and other refugees would be happy to have. But yes, the
Thank you.
long winter nights in Syria, I'm sorry, in Finland, they can be somewhat boring, but on balance, from what I hear, Finland is still a great place to live.
Well, it's definitely not boring in Syria now.
It's not boring, yeah. So there's a Chinese saying that says, it's a curse that says, may you live in interesting times, and times that are interesting for us to read about can be scary and dangerous for the people that actually have to live through them. We see that in Ukraine, in Syria, and other places with conflicts.
It's also true that for most of people here in the US, issues which people handle right now, there are barely comprehensible. We are too far and too remote. Do we have more questions, please? Questions or comments? If we don't, please, we thank Ilya for his wonderful presentation and expertise. And thank you for sharing with us.
I do have one more question, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Is there any government assistance for those who take refugees into their home, or do you have to pay that on your own?
Very little. However, I think the way something like Uniting for Ukraine works is that the refugees become self-supporting quickly. As I mentioned earlier, we have a hot job market in the United States. Of my own refugee sponsorees, one of them is already working as a security guard in Florida. The other one, we are working on getting her a hairdresser license, which ironically is turning out to be more complicated in getting them into the country in the first place. But as soon as she gets that license, she's eager to work and more than able to. The idea here is not to create a system of welfare dependency or of dependency on private charity, but rather to empower people to support themselves, which they can do in the vast majority of cases if only we give them the chance.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ilya, for joining us once again. And please come again if you have chance and time to talk to us.
I'd be happy to.
Highly appreciate your academic expertise and what you're doing in general. Dr. Shrey, please give our Ukrainian viewers our customary farewell greeting.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, в наших щоденних думках і молитвах, нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці і до наступного тижня прощаємося.
Thank you, everyone, and Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. God bless America.
Героям слава.
Thank you.